A couple days ago was the Geminids meteor shower, which is one of the biggest meteor showers of the year at around 120 meteors per hour. Unfortunately, it was overcast throughout the whole night on the peak, but the day after it was perfectly clear and the moon would set at 11:30, so I knew we'd have really good conditions to shoot some meteors. So I got outside and I shot a bunch of time lapses and I got some pretty cool meteor photos and I saw a lot of meteors. I'm going to go through all my techniques on how I shoot photos of meteors and then actually show you how I process these images as well. One of the first things I consider when I go out to take photos of meteors is the framing of the shot. So basically the goal is to maximize your chances of catching a meteor in the photo. So I like to use the widest lens I have and include as much sky as I can in the composition. By doing this, I can maximize the chances of actually getting a meteor in the photo, which is pretty rare. And another thing you'll want to do is set up your camera on a tripod, make sure it doesn't move, and then set a time lapse to go for a couple hours maybe. Setting up a time lapse will also increase your chances of catching a meteor because it lets the camera sit for much longer than it would normally in just a single photo. To set up a time lapse, you need something called an intervalometer, which basically tells the camera to take a photo at a specified interval. And for meteor photos, you're going to want to take photo after photo without any delay in between. Moving on to the camera settings, the first thing I'll consider when shooting photos of meteors is the shutter speed. So using a longer shutter speed will of course make for a brighter sky than a shorter shutter speed, but the shutter speed does not affect the brightness of the meteors. Because meteors only go through the sky for a fraction of a second, your shutter speed has no effect on the brightness of the meteor. So imagine a longer shutter speed with a bright sky and a bright meteor versus a shorter shutter speed with a dark sky and a bright meteor. The shorter shutter speed is going to give you a higher contrast and it's going to appear that the meteor is brighter even though it's not. So when I'm shooting meteors, I generally use a shorter shutter speed, maybe 5, 10 or 15 seconds. I usually won't go up to like 30 seconds or a minute because it'll start to wash out the sky a little bit more. So the shutter speed does not control the brightness of your meteors, but the aperture and the ISO do. So usually when I shoot at night, I'll go down to the lowest aperture I can, so maybe f1.8 or f1.4 if you have that. And then I'll set the ISO basically to whatever it needs to be to get the histogram properly exposed. And if you don't know what the histogram is, really put simply, the darker parts of the image are off to the left side of the histogram and the brighter parts are off to the right. And you don't want to clip either to the left or the right in the histogram because you won't be able to recover the shadows or highlights if you do that. So once you've got your camera locked off on a tripod and your timer set, basically you just let it sit there for a few hours and then maybe go back in the car and warm up. Check back in a couple hours and hopefully you've got some meteor photos. That's all for technique. Now I'm going to show you a little bit from the actual meteor shower and then we'll get back in and process these photos. I filmed this part in the field on my iPhone because I had both cameras going on time-lapse, but it ended up looking pretty terrible, so I'm just going to redo it right here. So basically I waited for the moon to set, as you saw in that time-lapse. It set around 11:30 and the sky got a whole lot darker, which really allowed me to see more meteors and see more stars. I had two cameras set up. First, my D3300 with a Sigma 18-35 at 18mm and f1.8, and that camera was pointed to the north, basically getting a star trail with the stars rotating around the North Pole, which I thought looked pretty cool. And then I had a second camera, the D610, which is filming this right now, and I had the 35 f1.8 lens on it. That camera was pointed up towards Orion and the Pleiades star cluster, and one cool thing about the day I was shooting was there was actually a comet in the sky, and you can see that as the little green blob in the photo. I thought that was pretty cool to actually capture a comet and a meteor in the same photo. I was out shooting for about 45 minutes until my lenses started getting covered in frost, as you can see in this photo here. Obviously I couldn't shoot any longer with the frost in the cameras like that, so I had to go warm up in the car, and once it was melted off I went outside a second time and got two different photos. One of them was pointed towards the North Pole again with a tree in the foreground, and a second one was pointed towards Orion with another tree in the foreground. These are the photos I got from that. lot of fun shooting meteors that day, and now I'm going to go in and actually edit these photos. So I'm going to use this photo as an example, and I'm going to show you how I did the edits on it, and then how I made a star trail photo out of it. So going into Lightroom, the first thing I'll do is adjust the white balance. It looks like it's a little magenta, so I'm going to drag that a little off to the greens, and drag the temperature a little to the blue side. And that looks a little bit better, right around there. And then I'll drag the highlights down a little bit and drag the whites up. What this does is it brings in a little contrast into the stars. And then drag the shadows back a little bit, bring up the contrast a bit, and then bring down the exposure. Right away you can see the stars pop out a whole lot more and the colors look a little bit better as well. I'll bring up the vibrance a little bit, bring down the saturation, and then move into the tone curve and just give it a little bit of an S-curve for some contrast. Maybe a little bit less. And I'll go into the HSL sliders. I don't really like this green down here from the farmhouse, so I'm going to take that green slider and move it a little bit off to the yellow, and that kind of makes it less apparent. Move the yellows a little bit to the orange, and the orange is a bit to the red. The red's a bit to the orange. That kind of just evens out the colors in the photo. Really subtle effect. I'll drag that green saturation slider down a little bit just to get rid of that green in there. Same with the blue or the aqua and yellow. And that's before and after on the HSL. Just a slight difference. Next I'll go into the detail section. I'll zoom in a little bit. The masking, usually I'll set this so basically it masks out all the parts that aren't stars, and it only sharpens the stars in the photo and not the noise. And then color noise reduction, I usually leave that on, and then luminance, I never turn that on. Go into lens corrections, check the boxes there, maybe have a slight vignette there. Looks a little bit better. Turn down the brightness a little bit. Maybe go into white balance and adjust that. It's a lot of jumping back and forth when I edit. That looks pretty good right there. I'm actually more happy with this edit than the previous one, which is this. I think this looks a whole lot better. So this looks pretty good. Now that I have it edited, I'll go into all the photos, basically select all these shots, and then I'll go in, I'll export these. Usually it's better to do TIFF, but my computer is pretty slow and it would take forever, so I usually export as a JPEG. But knowing that if you do export as a JPEG, you can't really do much for editing later on. I already have these shots exported, so I'm not actually going to do that now. But what I'm going to do next is open up a program called StarStax. And this is a free program. What it basically does is it takes all your photos from a time-lapse and it merges it into a star trail, which looks really awesome. So now that StarStax is open, basically all you got to do is drag in your images. These are the photos we took. Drag them into StarStax, and then it'll look through them. What it does is it has a thing called gap filling, which basically fills the gaps in between the stars if there are any. I usually have that turned on, although it doesn't really do a whole lot. There are other blending modes as well, but I usually just leave it on gap filling. And these are the settings that I use. And then basically all you have to do is click this button up here, which is the Start Processing button. It'll process through all the images in the stack, and then you can see it slowly making the star trails. And once that's done, all you have to do is work on the gap filling a little bit and then save the photo. Okay, StarStax just finished processing all the photos and it looks pretty awesome. One problem that I noticed is right in the bottom left corner here, there's a little bit of a white blob. And this is caused by a little bit of frost on the lens in the last 10 or 15 photos I took. So in the actual image that I processed, I cropped it up here so that you can't see that blob. And I also eliminated the last 10 or 15 shots from this stack. And that kind of got rid of the light in the bottom left corner of the photo. The next thing I do with StarStax is I will click the Show Threshold Overlay. This is for the gap filling mode. and I'll drag that up until the overlay is just over the stars and nothing else. Because what this does is it'll fill any small gaps in between the stars to make it look a little more even. I want to drag this up until there's really none of the sky overlaid by this mask, because it looks kind of bad when you have that. And then I'll usually drag the amount pretty low, just because I don't want any weird artifacts in the photo. So that's really it for processing a star trail photo. It's kind of an added bonus when you do a time lapse for meteors. You can also process it into a star trail photo. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And here are the final edited shots from the shoot.